Hey, everybody, welcome to Contra Talk. My name is Richard Henry, and this is the podcast where we talk about things that matter. Today, we're talking to a guest, first time guest. She is a wife and a mother. She is a professor down in Houston at a Christian college there, Christian University, author Nancy Pearcey. She's prolific speaker and writer. She's been around quite a long time, and we're going to be talking about her experience at L'Abri with Francis and Edith Schaeffer. She was part of that movement in the 70s, and we're going to get some inside details on what it was like and all the rest regarding just the movement there and how it's changed and how it's impacted the world and her faith and many others as well. Hope you enjoy this conversation. All right. Well, Professor Nancy Pearcey, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing well, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for taking some time. I've read your work, and I know you're a very prolific author. You're a speaker. You're a professor at a university, and I've heard you speak before in person. It's been a while. But one thing that always drew me as well was your time at L'Abri with Francis Schaeffer and his wife Edith way back when. And I want to talk about that today and just really kind of get your experience. I've not heard it from you or others. I know several other people have gone through L'Abri over the years. And of course, Francis died, in the early 80s and Edith later. So it's been a while since that's been an active place. But I know both of their works, especially Francis, have, written so many great works that are still read. And he's a big impact. He's been a big impact on me. So tell us just about your time at L'Abri. And well, first, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are? Just a brief introduction. I know you're a wife and a mother. Just tell us who you are.
Well, you kind of covered the bases quickly when you said I write books and I teach at a university. I teach at Houston
Very good.
Christian University, and I do teach apologetics, and that's part of the legacy of L'Abri. That I fell in love with apologetics, and that's what I teach. In fact, maybe the easiest way to get into who I am is to say why I ended up at L'Abri, because I was raised in a Lutheran home. I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran, so it's kind of an ethnic thing. It's
Sure.
an ethnic
Okay.
thing,
I didn't really know.
Yeah. It's like all Irish are Catholic. Yeah.
Sure.
So my parents are Lutheran because they're Scandinavian. But part of the weakness of an ethnic background like that is parents will often rely on the ethnicity to hold their kids. They often don't have a really strong personal commitment. And so when I started asking questions about my faith, which was in high school, I'm attending a public high school. All my textbooks are secular. All my teachers are secular. And I started just asking, well, how do we know Christianity is true? In a sense, how do we know we're right and they aren't?
Sure.
And so I asked my father, to tell you the truth, point blank one day, why are you a Christian? He said,
Yeah.
works for me. That's it.
Wow.
He's a university professor.
Wow.
Then I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and I thought, well, I'll get a more substantial answer from him. But all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as if it was a psychological phase that I would outgrow.
Wow.
And so with answers like that, I finally decided, well, Christianity clearly just doesn't have any real answers. And it seemed like a matter of intellectual honesty, that if you don't have good reasons for something, you shouldn't say you believe it. And so I decided I had to set aside my Christian upbringing and look for something that I really did believe. This is kind of ambitious for a 16-year-old, but I thought it's up to me to survey all the religions and philosophies out there and decide which one is really true. And it wasn't long before I realized that if there was no God, then there is no meaning to life. There is no foundation for ethics. It's just true for me, true for you. If there's no God, there's not even a foundation for knowledge. The way I thought of it is, if all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and space and history, what makes me think I could have any access to transcendental, objective, universal truth? Ridiculous.
Mm.
That's how I thought of it at the
Yeah.
time. So before I
Yeah.
graduated from high school, I had become, a relativist, a skeptic, a determinist, because of my science classes. We were taught we were just complex biochemical machines anyway. So I had absorbed all of these secularisms. And so I was the perfect person to end up at L'Abri because L'Abri was in Switzerland. Francis Schaeffer's ministry was called L'Abri. It was in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, and L'Abri is French for the shelter. And we had lived in Europe when I was a child. My dad had taught overseas. And so all through high school, I saved up my money because I really wanted to go back. I really loved it. And that's how I ended up sort of stumbling across L'Abri, being in Europe. And I was overwhelmed by this place. I was just stunned. I had never met any Christians who could engage with the secular isms that I had absorbed by that time, who could answer my questions, who could show that Christianity did have solid answers and could stand up in the marketplace of ideas. I mean, this was completely new to me. I was so surprised. In fact, I was so surprised that I left.
Like, I'm shocked. I can't handle this. Wow.
Actually, the way I thought of it at the time was it's such an attractive version of Christianity. It's very appealing, because not only was it intellectually rich, but as you know, Francis Schaeffer was known for cultural apologetics because he encouraged the arts. And I was in Germany at the Heidelberg Conservatory. I played the violin. So the arts angle was very important to me. And then I was there in 1971, and everyone there was hippies at the time. And I thought
at L'Abri or at the conservatory?
At L'Abri.
Okay.
Well, in Germany too, but no, at L'Abri. But it was not. There were not yet Christians reaching out to hippies. This was before the Jesus People movement, and so even that, I really did think, who are these Christians that they can even talk to hippies? To these disaffected young people. Wow. And so after a month, I left. I was afraid that that it was so attractive that I might be drawn in emotionally, and Christianity had already let me down once before. And so I did not want to be drawn in unless I was intellectually convinced it was true. I did not want to get drawn in emotionally. And by the way, my sister was there at the same time. She did get drawn in emotionally, and she did lose her faith the minute she left. So I did not want that to happen. So I went home, but because of L'Abri, I discovered apologetics. Schaeffer, and I think Oz was there. Oz Guinness was there when I was there the first time. Well, both times.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
Oz Guinness, yeah, and that's how I discovered C.S. Lewis and Chesterton. And so just through my reading, I finally thought, well, you can continue researching for a lifetime, but I do know enough that I think this is a good answer. I think I am intellectually convinced. And then I thought, where do I find other Christians? Because I wasn't in a church or anything. I was just reading these books on my own. So I thought, well, I knew some Christians back at L'Abri. So a year and a half later, I went back to L'Abri and stayed 5 months. Anyway, that was where I really sort of got grounded then in Christian worldview. And so I was there twice, actually, with a year and a half in between. And it was the early part. 1971 is the early part of L'Abri, and so it was very different. When I was there, it was mostly intellectually seeking non-Christians, because the news about L'Abri was spread mostly word of mouth. By the time I came back, it was starting to shift because his books had come out in between, and so it began to be known in Christian circles. And the type of people who started coming were more emotionally troubled Christians, because most Christian young people who have difficulties with their faith, it might be because of conflict with their parents and so on. And so there was gradually over time, it had started by the time I went there the second time. It was already, you could see a difference. That change continued over several years as L'Abri tried to figure out, well, what do we do? God is bringing very different people now to L'Abri. How do we deal with this? So L'Abri, a lot of people say, is L'Abri the same? It's not at all the same. the real L'Abri, sometimes call it, people say the real L'Abri, when it was reaching out to intellectually seeking non-Christian. Most of the people, they were not Christian. It was very much an evangelistic center. And so that was the real L'Abri that I did get a chance to be part of. And if you ever want to see a picture of me back then, my new book has a picture of me. When I was at L'Abri, I was looking for images to use in a PowerPoint presentation. And I found a photo of me. Somebody had been there at the same time, literally March 1971. I wonder if I could find it. Well, probably not fast enough. But if you want to see a photo,
buy the book and find the
buy the
picture.
book.
Right. Yeah, that's
I
right.
have long blonde hippie hair. Yeah. Nice. So yeah, a couple years ago, I actually have a photo because when I was there, I was not in a tourist mindset, so I didn't take photos, for goodness sake.
Right.
I was there wrestling with, is God real? Is there any truth?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow.
So that's kind of the big story.
Okay.
And that's
great.
That was my conversion. Yeah.
And so you came to Christ at L'Abri then, or was it afterward then? Still kind of like having some of those questions settled, and then you went to a church, or you heard a gospel track, or was it just a slow progression over time?
No, so I was there the first time, and I left because I was afraid I might be drawn in. And just through reading, I said, okay, I'm intellectually convinced. I was not in a church. I had no Christian friends. There's no gospel tract, as you put it. No, I just said, okay, I've read enough Schaeffer, As Guinness, C.S. Lewis. Okay, I'm pretty much convinced it's true. And it was very, people say you can't argue people into the kingdom, but it was very much of an intellectual ascent, at the beginning. Yeah. When I was at L'Abri, I talked to a young man from South Africa once, it was very international, and he'd become a Christian. And I was kind of hostile at that time and saying, anyone who was there who was a Christian, I kind of grill them, why did you do that? Why did you give up the fight?
Yeah.
And he said, well, they shot down all my positions. And I said, that's it? and then actually, that's kind of how it worked for me too. Well, they shot down all my secular isms. And they showed that Christianity had better ideas. Okay. I mean, isn't that what philosophy is about? Philosophy is about getting better explanations for the world as we know it. And I said, okay, Christianity does have better answers.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's something, and I say it often when I'm preaching and just in conversation, and it's something I think we've really lost in the church in general, especially in the West, is Jesus is better. I mean, Jesus is better than XYZ, abortion or open borders or this or this or this or all these other things, or having an open marriage or all this other stuff. No, Jesus is better. And I think a lot of Christians today think, well, it's just a marketplace of ideas and this and this and this, and it's kind of a buffet, and maybe Jesus is just like Islam and this, or Latter-day Saints or whatever. At the end of the day, who really knows? Everybody has doubts, like you said earlier, that the professor said. And it's like, well, no, Jesus is better. I mean, there's countless stories from church history, recent church history, of missionaries, or just how unapologetic, or even Schaeffer. I mean, they didn't go there originally, if I'm remembering right, to do that, but it kind of morphed into that, and people are there, and then it attracts many people. And Jesus is better. Jesus is better than believing in determinism, or that we're just molecules in motion. So it's yeah, I mean, we need to recapture that as Christians, as men and women, boys and girls, to really understand that no, Jesus is better. So when you make an apologetic for the hope that is in you, as Peter says, you're saying, well, because Christ is crucified and he's risen, right? And he's worthy of our worship. So that makes a difference.
Yeah, you talked about how it developed. So how did he end up at Switzerland? Well, he was sent over. He was sent over by a mission board to assess the state of the churches after World War II. And he came back and he gave his report, and they said, we think you should be the one to go. You should go fix it.
Yeah.
So that's how he ended up in Europe.
Sort of. Yeah.
And then as his daughters, he had 3 older daughters, as they went down the mountain, it was in the Swiss Alps. So they went down the mountain to Lausanne University. They would talk to their friends about God, right? And they would say, you should talk to my dad about that. he's really good with questions like that. And
Yeah.
so they take the little train. You've seen those little Swiss mountain trains.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been on. My
They-
wife and I went to Switzerland and Interlaken and Lauterbrunnen right there, and they're
oh,
little small trains right there. Very pretty.
oh, cool. Yeah.
Right.
So the students would take the train up the mountain to Le Brie. It was such an inaccessible little spot in the mountains that
Hmm.
people would just stay for the weekend. And then they go down and tell their friends, and a new group would come up the next weekend, and they'd tell their friends, and another group would come up until they had students on all the couches and all the hallways and all the balconies. And it sort of
Wow.
grew organically into a place where people would come and stay for a period of time and actually sort of live in this Christian community and in this Christian family home and see how Christians interact. That's what made it unique because if Francis Schaeffer had just been a good writer and speaker, a talking head, to show up at conferences and be a talking head, I don't think he would have had the impact he did. Instead,
Hmm.
his people came and actually lived with him, or the way the ministry grew is if people wanted to join the ministry. Often they were people who had converted there, and so they would join it by simply buying a house down the street. The houses
Mm,
in the Swiss Alps are chalets, so
right.
it sounds like a luxury home to say chalet, but no, it's just the kind of houses they live in. So they would buy the chalet down the street and open their home, and then another couple might open a chalet, the other direction. So it's just a few chalets clustered in a little Swiss village. That's all Le Brie ever
Mm,
was. And then you would live with a Christian family. And a lot of people said when they converted, was not just the apologetics that was persuasive. It was seeing a form of Christian community and love that they had never experienced before. And I would say that was part of my conversion as well, to actually see a form of Christian love that I had not seen back home in my family or my church. So
yeah.
that was what made it unique was the community that Francis and Edith Schaeffer managed to build up, so that people really lived there and saw. Schaeffer couldn't fake it.
Yeah.
If you're just a talking head and you fly into a conference, you can fake it, but he
Yeah.
couldn't fake it. We saw how he interacted with his family members, with his staff, with the students. He was authentic. He was the real deal.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of John's the apostle writing about Christ's words. All the world will know that you are my disciples if you have
Mhm.
love for one another, and of course, love is insanely twisted even in the church, and especially in the culture as basically license, which is clearly not what love is at all. But having authentic, true love of really gathering with people and getting to know people and spending, even if you're never like sleeping over, but having meals with people. I mean, this is what hospitality is huge.
Mhm.
I was listening to another evangelical, Rosario Butterfield,
Yeah,
and how was
I
her
figured.
transition. Yeah, and just being a radical lesbian and all this, and professor, and spending so much time in a Francis Schaeffer type way that pastor
Mhm.
was, and loving
Mhm.
her and just answering questions. And sometimes I think we kind of try and jump the gun, or we think, well, I have to tell him it's wrong, or I have to do it. It's like, absolutely, in due time. I mean, it's God's patience that leads us to repentance. And oftentimes, I know for me, my own heart, it's kind of like, or don't say anything then. Forget it. Or you're impatient to jump to the gun, to the conclusion of, well, you're in sin, type of thing. And anyway, so it's
Yeah, and
often a
in
slow
fact,
process.
one of Schaeffer's, I think it was one of his last books. It's really just a booklet called "The Mark of a Christian." The Mark of the Christian, and the whole
Hmm.
point is, without love, love is the final apologetic. That's how he put it. Love is the final apologetic. If love is quoting from John there, love is how you know truly that you are a Christian. And so
Yeah,
it is consider love part of your apologetic strategy.
yeah. No, that's good. Um, Real love, right? First Corinthians 13, love and love like that. Um, You mentioned Oz Guinness. I know there's a few other names, and they're not coming to mind. Who else was there? I guess just kind of give people a good. Some people might know, they might not. The audience, whatever. But who else was there during your time that you met or that came afterward that we may know today?
Yeah. So Oz was there both times that I was there. And Ronald Macaulay, who was one of Francis Schaeffer's son in laws, who then went to England and started the English Libri.
Okay.
And many people feel that he carried on Schaeffer's legacy perhaps better than anyone else. That the English Libri was the closest thing after Schaeffer passed away. The English Libri was most like what we knew in the early Libri. And I'm trying to think who else. The guy who started the Massachusetts Libri, Dick Keyes. Dick Keyes started the Massachusetts Libri.
Okay.
And Greg Grooms, Greg Grooms has something Libri-ish, Libri-like in Austin, Texas.
Oh, okay.
Greg Grooms. And let me think. Oh, of course, Bill Edgar. Bill Edgar, who teaches at Westminster. William
Okay.
Edgar, who teaches at Westminster now. He was actually there before I was there, but I've gotten to know him since. And
Wow.
he was very shaped by his time at Libri. And in terms of the students, I don't meet a whole lot because people don't understand. I have been asked sometimes, why was it that people would come there for 3 months? With these short term. And the answer is most European countries, you can get a tourist visa for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, you have to transfer to some other kind of visa, and it's more complicated and so on. And so because of that, people would come, and it's kind of like a semester abroad. It turned into a little bit like semester abroad for college students, because it's the 3-month visa is what put the limit on it for many people. So what that meant was people were coming through constantly. And so most of the people I would have known as students, they were in and out. They were here one day and gone the next. So it was a lot harder to keep up any sort of relationship with people because they were there such a short time.
So I guess, and again, for my own sake, but also for the listener, because I might know more than the average person. Maybe not. I don't know about it because I've read some of the biographies that they wrote and other things. But so I guess we probably should have said this earlier. I should have, but timeline wise, so he went after World War II. We're talking late 40s into the 50s. When did Libri kind of get going? Because you mentioned 1971, you were there, and then you left and came back. Give us a little bit more of a timeline. I probably should have said this earlier, but okay. What's the timeline of when it was? I know he passed away in 1984, right? Is that right? Something like that.
I'm so bad with dates. I
think it was. I was born in 83, so I think he was either the year before or a year after me. But anyway, what's the timeline on Libri when it kind of got going and all that?
Well, so they didn't start it immediately because they went over there with 2 mission groups, Child Evangelism Fellowship, and then I think a denominational mission group, I think. At any rate, so at first they were doing missions, and Schaeffer was speaking all around Europe, and he had a heart for evangelism anyway. He could not talk to somebody and start evangelizing them.
Yeah.
But Libri didn't really take off as Libri until like I said, his kids reached college age and started going down the mountain to the university. And that's when it suddenly turned out he had this real gift for talking to college age young people who had intellectual questions. Before that, it wasn't so specified. He talked to a lot of different audiences, but when it became sort of more focused as an intellectual ministry, specifically to young college students, that's the age where they're encountering all these secularisms. But they're on the college campus, they're encountering ideas much more than you or I when we're in the adult world. We're actually not encountering as many challenges to our faith. We're not sitting in one college class after another where various isms, relativism. Oh, my sociology class when I was in college, my sociology class was the most relativistic. I got totally sucked back into it because the relativism was just so permeating everything. Well, then you go to your philosophy class, or you go to your science class, and they're teaching, Darwinian materialism, and you're just a product of blind material forces. And so, college is when young people are usually dealing with these, face to face every day in every class. So that's when his kids got to be college age. that his ministry did change to being more focused on that age group. Because they are the ones who typically are asking these questions. Now, it's true today, young people are losing their faith even earlier.
Mm-hmm.
There was the the Institute for Family Studies, IFS, just did a survey by Lyman Stone. He's a sociologist. And it was really eye-opening. He interviewed parents and their kids, and they asked the parents, how are your kids doing, in terms of their faith, and you could see the graph. The parents were pretty confident. Yeah, kids are going to youth group, they're going to church, my kids are fine. And then the kids, same family, they asked the kids, and the kids were like, nah, I don't think I believe this stuff anymore. Oh, I'm not so sure this is true. And they were losing their faith by around average age 13. Age 13 today. And so two things that are surprising: it's younger than it used to be, and number two, their parents are clueless. Most of their parents did not know that their kids were having these questions. So that. If you want to look it up, Institute for Family Studies, it was fairly recent. You might be able to find. I don't remember what the title was, but you might be able to find it. So in a sense, I think our challenge is changing to some degree, because it's still a good thing to do apologetics for university students. They still need to be equipped to answer all the isms, the secular isms they encounter. But we also have to think more about how to reach younger kids who are encountering secular ideas. They're so immersed in the social media. They're spending 24 hours a day virtually on social media, so that they are surrounded, even though they don't have in-person friendships as much. This was some survey that just came out today, American survey, blah, blah, blah. I don't remember the title. Anyway, it's just out today. Teenagers are lonelier than ever because they're not in in-person relationships, but they're on social media 24/7. Right? So their mindset is being shaped by their peer group. Their thoughts, their feelings, their sense of self is being shaped by their peer group to a much greater degree than any past generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, and I mean, that makes sense with a lot of the trans stuff and other things where you're going through puberty, you're 12, 13, 14, and you're like, oh, this is weird. I must be a boy, and when I'm really a girl, or vice versa. And it's like, nah, no, most people don't like puberty. It's just what it is. You'll get over it. And there's all sorts of studies that, 95% of people regret this and change that, and they go back to what they were doing and everything else. So, yeah, I mean, it's that artificialness of this space. And, we're talking right now, but we're still not embodied souls in the same space at the same time, right? There's still a level of, on the phone, okay, or a video call, but we're not physically in the same space. And that still matters, because again, all of this is so very material, all the isms and everything. And so you don't have that, just is built in, kind of baked into the cake of, well, it doesn't matter, talk to somebody online or talk to somebody on the phone or whatever. There's no difference really. And of course there is, because we are souls in bodies. We will have, that embodiedness and that spatial closeness. And anyway, so I think it's a lot of Christians don't even think that way. They're kind of practical materialists in that way, where we just kind of think, well, yeah, but there's God up there somewhere, but they don't have a lot of those answers, or even know how it kind of forms with the rest of life, including social media. So what was were you there then longer than 3 months? I guess it sounded like you were. Did you work there, or just like, yeah?
So it was a month in 1971, March.
Okay.
And a year and a half later, I went back, and I actually did stay 4 months. I can't remember how I got that fourth month in there, but yeah, I stayed from September through December and went home for Christmas.
Okay.
So yeah, and in some ways that was cool. So I got the introduction to Schaeffer. I had some time to think about it, a year and a half to think about it and read his books and discover Lewis and all that, and then go back and really get immersed. So I think maybe that's when it took as well as it did, because I had I had such an extended period there. And so, as you may know, I mean, if you read any of my books, you see Schaeffer's fingerprints there. You see
Oh,
the
absolutely.
impact of his thinking. The main one being, of course, that he one of his main messages was the central barrier to communicating with non-Christians today is that the concept of truth has changed. The concept of truth has split in half. And it's what in secular academia we call the fact value split. And it means that, the big picture is, virtually all civilizations have known that there's a natural order and there's a moral, spiritual order, but they thought that the two are integrated into a single cosmos. And therefore, truth about it would also be a single integrated system of thought. And we thought that way in the West as well until the scientific revolution. And then people began to say, oh no, the only reliable form of knowledge is what we know scientifically, empirically verifiable facts. Well, if that's true, what do you do with moral and spiritual truths? Well, basically they said they're not truths anymore. And so Schaeffer used the metaphor of two stories in a building where facts, is objectively true. That's in the lower story. And then people have sort of tossed into the upper story, the attic, anything that didn't fit. So morality, spirituality, beauty, meaning, purpose, anything that's not reducible to, what you can see, hear, weigh, and measure, what you can know empirically. And so that split view of truth, the fact value split, he said that the reason that that's such a problem for Christians, when we need to understand it, is because when we say to somebody Christianity is true, if they hold this two-story view of truth, this fact value split, they automatically, unreflexively put what you say in the upper story, where they interpret that as, this is my personal meaning. This is what gives me a sense of, purpose and meaning in life. This is my personal preference. This is purely my privatized faith. That's what they hear you say. You are trying to make an objective truth claim, that based on scripture, and they're hearing it as your private personal preference. And that's why Schaeffer said, in many ways, you have to almost do pre-evangelism. You have to explain what truth is before you can explain what Christianity is when it's making that claim. And I'll personalize this because that's exactly what happened to me at L'Abri. I was such an extreme relativist that when I went to L'Abri, I had to go through that two-stage process. I had to first argue it out with them, whether there was any such thing as objective truth before I could even consider whether Christianity was that truth. And so that split view of truth, you'll find it's in all my writings, because it turns out if your view of truth, it changes, it affects everything. It affects everything else. So all my writings end up coming back in one way or another to the split view of truth and how it affects every single subject area now.
Yeah. No, and that does show that, again, that cohesiveness, that if God is God, if the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the creator, and this is something, and I just preached a sermon on this not too long ago, of really looking at Acts 2 versus Acts 17. It was a one-off sermon I was at a different church, not my church I pastor. And, Peter's preaching to the Jews. He doesn't have to talk about Moses. He doesn't have to talk about Yahweh. It's baked in, we know, just like, and I kind of made the comparison, it's not 100%, but I say Independence Day, 4th of July, apple pie, baseball, we all know what that means. But if a Russian comes over who speaks, fluent English, but has zero understanding of it, you have to go back further. Well, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, 1776, 1789, and looking at these dates and these things, you have to go back further. And that's what Paul does, right? In Acts 17, the classic Mars Hill Areopagus, and explaining the God you worship in ignorance is the creator. And you have to go back to this further. You can't just take that truth for granted. And I think a lot of Christians still don't think that.
No, I write about that in some of my books because it's such an important point. That in essence, our parents' generation was still speaking to the Jews in the sense of people who were churched and had some some Christian background, even if they didn't believe it. Whereas we're talking to the Greeks, people who have no background. But I hadn't thought of making the 4th of July analogy. That's a really good one. I'm going to take that from you if you don't mind.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, no, it's I mean, it matters. And I think, like you're saying, when you're talking to somebody, they think, well, that's good for me, or that's good for you. But that's not just good. Jesus is better good. Where is it morally right or wrong to do X? Well, yeah, it kind of depends. It's like, well, no, no, morality doesn't just kind of depend. But a lot of times, especially with college campuses, and it's been that way for decades, really now, and not just the college, but uh,
Yeah.
mainstream media, right, and even Washington and local politics, and everything's just so assumed that we live in this material world. Maybe there's a God, but I'm not sure really what he does. Maybe Jesus was God, but like, does it really make much of a difference? Not really. Let's still vote for this or do this or whatever.
Well,
It's crazy.
if you hear somebody say "true for me, true for you," then they're speaking from Schaeffer's upper story. Right? The upper
Mhm.
story are where you put things like morality and spirituality and beauty and goodness and so on. And so when somebody says, "Well, you can," that can be your truth. It's not my truth. That's
Right.
a sure clue that they're speaking from the upper story at that moment. Now,
Yeah.
one of my students, I think it was just last week, said, But wait a minute, most people seem inconsistent because they do think there's objective truth in certain areas, and that's why the split view of truth is so important. It's not just that
Hmm.
the problem is relativism. The problem is relativism is in the upper story, but many people still believe in objective truth when it comes to things like science and reason and rationality and testable truths are all in the lower story. Now, I must
Hmm.
say that's taken a beating in the last few years, where the follow the science has now discredited the very notion of science, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I think the upper story has just expanded to include a lot of things we used to think were scientific. But it still is true. William Lane Craig makes this argument too. So he's a fairly well-known Christian apologist, and yeah, and he does a lot of debates on college campuses. And he
Hmm.
wrote once, this whole idea that college students are postmodern. He says, I don't see it. They are postmodern only when it comes to theological moral truths, but they're just as modernist as.
Yeah. Oh, I think I lost you. You got muted there. I'm not sure what happened. I don't know if the mic got disconnected. Yeah, you're still disconnected. It says you're muted on your end. Maybe do you have a separate like auxiliary that you could unplug or something? Or the microphone die? Yeah, I still can't hear you. That's really strange. There we go. Well, the mute button's gone.
Am I back?
Yes. There we go.
I don't know what that was.
Yeah, that was
I don't
weird.
know what that was. I got a sign saying, your mic has been unplugged. And I'm like, what?
How
No, it
weird.
hasn't.
Yeah. Okay. Uh,
Okay. Well,
you mentioned it
it,
kind of cut out
mhm.
at you said William Lane Craig, and then you said they're only uh, that's where it cut
Postmodern.
out. Yeah, the students are only postmodern when it comes to like religious theological stuff.
Right. So from his own experience on the college campus, William Lane Craig says, I don't see students being postmodern. They're postmodern only when it comes to religious and moral truths, they're not postmodern when it comes to, economics and science and politics and so on. And so he was seeing from his own experience the effect of the fact value split, or the two-story view of truth that Schaeffer talks about. I thought that was really cool that he could see it
Yeah.
in his, in his many encounters on campus.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Because, yeah, I mean, most people, no one's a relativist, really. I mean, they're really not at
Right.
the end of the day. I mean, it's like, when you talk about any sort of atrocity, if you turn it on that person, it's like, well, not me. I don't want to be robbed. I don't want to be stabbed. I don't want to be, sexually whatever, you know. Oh, okay. So it's not really moral or relative or whatever. So no, that's good. Would you recommend any? I know we briefly were talking earlier before we started recording. Is Labrie still good and strong and going? Would you recommend people go there? And if not, why not? And where should they go instead? Like young people, especially.
Yeah, it has changed a lot. I mentioned earlier that when I was there, it was mostly intellectually seeking non-Christians.
Hmm.
And as his books came out, he became, in a sense, a victim of his own fame, because Labrie began to attract emotionally troubled Christians, who
Oh,
lost their faith or were struggling with their faith, mostly because of conflicts with their parents and so on, which is and Labrie, the staff at Labrie actually struggled with this for several years. They said, "What should we do?" And Udo Mittelmann, speaking of other people who were there, Udo, who was another one of Schaeffer's son-in-laws, married to Debbie, um, Udo would say, if they're not asking the intellectual questions, we need to make them ask the intellectual questions.
that's
And
funny.
the rest of the staff said, well, if we're getting these more emotionally troubled people who just have more emotional needs, for hospitality and openness and affection and warmth, maybe we should shift to that. So this became a big enough deal that they split. Udo
Hmm.
went off and started his own ministry a little higher up the Swiss Alp. um, and for a long time, Labrie sort of redefined their mission as hospitality. As
Yeah.
having, the idea of people coming and living there and just loving them emotionally. And to be honest, there was a time. It's when I wrote my book Finding Truth, which if people who are
Oh, that
watching,
one. Yeah, yeah. I've got
it's
that one.
when I wrote Finding Truth, and I was invited to speak at the annual Labrie conference. And the staff person who's in charge of the conferences stood up and said, apologetics just has not been popular for a while. And we're so happy it's finally sort of coming back. They even named the conference Finding Truth, as a way of saying, we're coming back to
Hmm.
apologetics. So I think in recent years they've tried to come back a bit more to apologetics, but they certainly, for a period of time, they had sort of lost that as their mission. So I don't think from what I hear now. I haven't been there for a while, but from what I hear, it the it's become almost like a Christian retreat center. It doesn't have a strong apologetic. The original Swiss Labrie, does not seem to, and it does not seem to have a strong message anymore. And you don't live in people's homes. The whole ethos is different. There's
Oh,
there's a
wow.
there's a dormitory. There's a
Gotcha.
cafeteria. There's a
Hmm.
there's a volleyball court. I mean, it doesn't it doesn't look the same at all. So there are places where I think Labrie still has a small some of the smaller offshoots. The
Hmm.
the the English Labrie, I've heard, the one that Ranald Macaulay has run for many years. For many years, it had the reputation of fulfilling, of carrying on Schaeffer's style of apologetics ministry,
Yeah.
perhaps more than any other place. And then the one in Massachusetts, I think, is doing pretty good work too. That's the one that's run by Dick Keyes. So they're good. They're doing good work. Um, but it's still quite different. I still, these days, if people say, "Oh, should I go there or should I send my kid there?" I'm like, "Nah, well, find a good Christian college for your kid. You're gonna
Mm.
get a lot more intellectual input going to a really strong Christian college that teaches Christian worldview." and
Yeah.
and it'll be in an academic setting. They'll be reading good books. Hillsdale College, for example, or Grove City College. Well, I should also say my own university, Houston Baptist. I think the environment of a Christian college is probably the closer you're going to get to a community of scholars who are thinking together about how to have a Christian worldview. I mean, that was its original purpose, and I think they're carrying it on perhaps now more than some smaller ministries that, parachurch ministries that have the like L'Abri. It's just, it's just not thriving the way it used to be.
Right. No, that's good. So there isn't really, I mean, I don't think you mentioned it. We were talking earlier, that there really isn't anything besides like just the regular Christian university, Bible college type thing, but not necessarily maybe a Bible college, but really asking those questions and shaping young people. I mean, you mentioned the L'Abri in England and in Massachusetts, but there isn't, as far as other places that are kind of what the early 70s L'Abri was happening right now, right?
Certainly, there have been people who wanted to do it. I've met so many people because, with my L'Abri connections, they will sometimes talk to me about how they would like to try something like that. And well, the only one that I think he's pulled it off. Greg Grooms used to work at L'Abri, and he's
Okay.
in Austin, Texas, and has a kind of a study center and ministers to the college students at University of Texas in Austin, which is, by the way, a very challenging place. It's extremely liberal. Texas as a state tends to be more conservative, and then they've got this little pocket of San Francisco practically in Austin. So I'm sure they have a pretty fun ministry to college students there. But so there's a few people out there doing things. And Christian, there are universities that have Christian study centers. They're doing a good job sometimes. UVA, University of Virginia, has a Christian study center connected to the university. Now, not officially connected, but they've started something where you can actually take classes in Christian worldview and theology and apologetics. I don't know for sure what their current classes are, but they're ways to get a more intellectual input, into your understanding of Christianity. And they've worked it out where you get credit from the local from a Christian university, which then transfers to UVA. So you're getting college credit, so you're doing this kind of on the side alongside your normal major, and you are getting college credit. So there's a few places like that, and I thought that was a really good idea. I would like to see more Christian, and I think there are some. If you Google like Christian Study Center movement, there are some others I haven't really kept up on, but it's a really good way to number one, most Christian students end up at secular universities, partly because most people cannot afford Christian college. And so having something for them is very important. And secondly, it's more fun. These kids are actually dealing with secular ideas every single day in every single class. And so, they're out of the Christian bubble, so to speak. And so the Christian study centers really, I think, have a wonderful opportunity to equip young people who are going through secular universities.
No, that's a good point. I like that. Well, I think our time is more or less expired, but I know your latest book, Toxic War on Masculinity. Why don't you give us just a little bit of a plug on that? I think you grabbed it earlier with the picture of you back at L'Abri. Briefly, just tell us about that book and what took you that. I know that's probably a whole other show, but what's that book about, and why should someone read it?
Well, I started it to answer. I'm an apologist, so I started to answer it. I wanted to answer the secular world that says evangelical Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity. Right? We're seen as being, the worst of the bunch, and so I wanted to say, well, where is this coming from? Where is the secular view of masculinity coming from? Well, there are two things. Why does the secular world get its view of masculinity so wrong that it actually calls it toxic? So I wanted to analyze that. And then while I was doing that, I stumbled across the sociological data on Christian men showing that Christian men, instead of being exhibit A of toxic masculinity, actually test out at the top as being the most loving husbands and fathers. And so I thought, my goodness, I was looking at the problem, the secular view of masculinity, but I sort of stumbled across these sociological studies showing the answer to the problem. So the book has the problem and the answer, which is cool. And most people don't know about these studies showing that evangelical men do so well. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find it. But in fact, Christian men, their wives test out saying that they're happiest in their marriage. Evangelical men spend more time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week than secular fathers. Evangelical couples divorce at a lower rate than any other group, 35% lower than secular men. And then the real surprise is that they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So it completely debunks the secular narrative. I had no idea. We all kind of hear this, the secular message that if you believe in any sense of male headship in the home, that turns you into an overbearing, abusive, tyrannical patriarch. And so I was stunned. I was stunned when I found this data. I quote about a dozen or so studies from different sociologists and psychologists who actually not only do our churches need to know this, right? They need to be encouraging Christian men, but it also gives us what we can take out into the public square. It's not a pep talk from a religious leader. It's solid empirical research. These are evidence-based findings showing that the secular narrative is completely wrong.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, that's good. Well, everyone listening, pick up The Toxic War on Masculinity. I want to read it. I haven't read it yet. Yeah, I don't think I have a copy either. So I'll have to get that and read it. That sounds good and exciting. It's always helpful and be encouraged, because a lot of times the air we breathe and the water we swim in, it's so secular so often. Even if we're in a good church or a good school or, a good community, it's still difficult with, the ads that come through our phones or the billboards on the road or the commercials on our TV. All those people are generally godless and have a materialist worldview, and it still seeps into everything else that they do. So I think a lot of Christians, our guard is down and we think, it's like, well, no, everybody has a worldview, right? So, well, Professor Nancy Pearcey, I appreciate it so much. This has been wonderful. And where can people find you, track you down? Are you on Twitter, website, or X, I guess it's called now? Where can people connect with you or follow you?
Yes, I am fairly active on Twitter, by the way. And by the way, speaking of my new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, I had after it came out, I had months of debates on Twitter. I was really attacked viciously from both sides on Twitter. So I've been much more active on Twitter than I used to be, because I had to interact with all these critics. And most of them hadn't read the book, by the way. This was the interesting thing about this book, is that even when it was in manuscript form, it was proving to be the most controversial book I've written, because I would teach the manuscript in my classes. I had lots of reading groups. I like to get a lot of feedback. And when people they just heard about it, and they would say, the first question was always, whose side is she on? Like with that tone. And men tended to just assume that a woman writing on the subject would be a male bashing feminist. And more progressive types tended to just assume that I was some reactionary, defensive culture warrior. And so I had to rewrite my first chapter over and over again to get past that initial hostility, because once people got into the data, it's the most fact-based book I've written. All that sociological data on Christian men, which is incredibly encouraging. And then I give a lot of historical data on, well, where did the secular view come from? Because if we don't know the secular view, if you don't have a critical grid in place, you're going to absorb it. And I'll give you one example. This is one of my former graduate students, now teaches high school. And she wrote to me and said, what should I do? All my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. And if your audience doesn't know who Andrew Tate is, he's kind of the paradigm of fast cars, fast money, fast women. But he's become a huge internet influencer, because he does tell men to work out and to make money. But then he acknowledges that he made his money by creating pornography. Yeah,
Right. Yeah. He's not the paragon of virtue. Yeah.
I mean, he literally did. He said that in an interview. He said, "I'm a pimp." At
Yeah.
any rate, so when she says, "All my male students are into Andrew Tate," I said, "Where do you teach?" At a classical Christian school.
Wow.
So I thought,
Wow.
okay,
Oh my
you
goodness.
know, even young Christian men are going to be drawn into these online influencers if the
Hmm.
church does not communicate a strong, healthy, biblical view of masculinity.
Wow. Wow. That's good. Well, everyone listening, go check out that book. It's very good. And so you're on Twitter /X. That's the primary way people can connect with you
Oh,
and follow your work.
I'm sorry. Forgot to say my website. My
All
website
right.
is probably the better place. So my publisher was kind enough to redesign my website so it's colorful and fun now.
Right.
NancyPearcey.com, and Pearcey is Pearcey. Don't forget the extra E. NancyPearcey.com, and you can browse my other books. You can see who endorsed them. You can leave a message. It's NancyPearcey.com. So come on over and say hello.
Perfect. Well, great. Very good. I'll put those links in the description for everybody else. So, Professor Nancy Pearcey, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I just love
God bless.
talking about Libri. So thank you.
Yeah. No, it was good. Thank you. Professor down in Texas, and apologetics. Let's start that over. Yes, Gwendolyn, what do you need, sweetheart? I need to do one last thing. Just give me a hug. Whoa, you're cute today, sweetheart.
I'm supposed to be a flower.
You're very cute, dog. Did you shut the door?